They were born behind silken veils and marble walls, daughters of emperors draped in silk before they could even walk. To the world outside the palace, they were living emblems of power and untouchable beauty. But within the shadowed chambers of the empire, these princesses carried a quiet terror. Their wedding night was not a celebration. It was a sentence written long before they could speak. In the heart of Topkapi Palace, far from the gaze of commoners, a tradition older than any single sultan pulsed like a heartbeat through centuries. Every royal daughter, no matter how young, no matter how unwilling, would one day be given away. Not in love, not in choice, but in strategy. Each marriage was a thread in the vast web of imperial control, and each wedding night was the tightening of that web. Powerful men, often twice or thrice their age, were chosen for them. Viziers, pashas, warlords who bent their knee to the sultan in public, but who, behind locked doors, would claim the princess not as a wife, but as property. She did not marry for herself. She married for the empire, and the empire, like a jealous god, demanded bloodless sacrifice. Soft choir builds under thunder. Their fathers, mighty sultans who commanded continents, never asked their daughters what they wanted. Their marriage was signed like a treaty, sealed with silence. And on the night of the wedding, the princess would step into a world stripped of royal titles. In the bedchamber, she was no longer a princess. She was a symbol. The weddings were lavish, breathtaking, designed to dazzle the empire. But the more beautiful the ceremony, the darker the night that followed. Hundreds of guests celebrated with music and incense, while the princess's heartbeat grew heavier beneath her jeweled gown. For the empire, a princess's wedding night was the beginning of a new political bond. For the girl herself, it was often the end of her innocence, and the beginning of a gilded prison. The palace whispered of many such nights. Some princesses cried, others were too numb to cry, and some never returned the same. Behind every royal wedding portrait, behind every embroidered veil, lived a story no scribe dared write. This was the empire's most beautiful cruelty, hidden not by chains, but by jewels. Some brides were sent to distant provinces the next morning, away from their mothers, their language, their childhood courtyards. They were placed in strange palaces, surrounded by guards who answered to their husbands, not their bloodline. Even as princesses, they had no shield. Low hum of wind through iron gates. And the empire called it duty. The princesses called it fate. But in truth, it was a quiet war. One waged not on battlefields, but in silk-draped rooms, with tears instead of swords. Not all of them survived it whole. Some became shadows of themselves, silent figures moving through gilded halls like ghosts. Others learned to wear masks thicker than their veils, but a few learned to fight back from within the golden cage. Subtle shift in score, strings rising faintly beneath the silence. In the 17th century, one royal daughter would change the whispers into a storm. Kösem Sultan, though born not of imperial blood, but later raised to unimaginable power, became the silent godmother of this hidden struggle. She saw how wedding nights stole power from women, and she turned that theft into a weapon. Kösem understood that control did not only live in armies or thrones. It lived in marriage contracts, in alliances sealed with trembling hands. She began to weave her own web, marrying princesses to men she could control, turning their terror into leverage. But even her power could not undo the fear. The wedding night remained a ritual of silence. Girls of 13, 14, sometimes younger, were dressed in gold and led like lambs to gilded slaughter. Thunder rolls softly, a slow zoom into darkness. No chronicles dared describe these nights. Historians wrote about conquests, treaties, and sultans, but they left out the soft cries behind locked doors. They left out the moments when empires were built on the shaking shoulders of girls. Whispers say some princesses tried to escape. A few succeeded, disappearing into convents, disguises, or faraway estates. But many were dragged back. Their freedom cost too much for an empire addicted to control. When they returned, their punishments were not written in ink. Their punishment was silence. They were erased from letters, from portraits, from memory. To the world, they had never existed. This silence was the empire's greatest weapon, The fewer the voices, the fewer the questions. And so, centuries passed like this. Silk weddings followed by shadowed nights, each one burying a name that could have changed history. Soft flute and wind rise under the narration. But no silence lasts forever. Over time, the veil began to thin. Foreign envoys whispered about the hidden terror of Ottoman princesses. Poets hinted at forbidden sorrows. And behind the palace walls, some princesses learned to speak with actions rather than words. Some began to influence their husbands, not as brides, but as queens behind the throne. Their wedding night might have been forced upon them, but their future would not be. In a court ruled by men, the princesses found quiet ways to rule. They gathered allies among eunuchs, servants, and forgotten wives. Whispers became instructions. Fear became strategy. Score shifts. Low drumbeat beneath whispers. Yet no power could erase what had been done to them. No crown could soften the memory of that first night. Some carried it like a wound beneath their jewels for the rest of their lives. This is the forgotten history of power, that empires are not only built on battlefields, but in rooms where girls had no choice, that every treaty inked in royal halls echoed through silk-draped bedrooms. Today, the portraits of Ottoman princesses still hang in museums. They smile faintly through the brushstrokes of painters who never knew their truth. They are remembered for their beauty, rarely for their pain. But history listens differently when the silence is broken. These women, whose wedding nights were written like laws, were more than pawns. They were the empire's unspoken backbone. Their fear was real. Their resilience, legendary. Soft choir swells beneath fading thunder. Diaries stunned, the empire fell, the sultans vanished, the palaces turned to museums. But the whispers remain. Every silk thread still remembers the hands that trembled beneath it. Every corridor remembers the footsteps of girls who were never allowed to choose. They were princesses, but they were also prisoners, and through the centuries, their silence became part of the empire's power. But if you listen carefully, beneath the rustle of silk and the call to prayer, you can still hear them. History is often written by those who hold the sword, but sometimes it is whispered by those who had nothing, not even a choice. Their wedding nights may be long gone, but their stories are not. They were born to be symbols, raised to be sacrifices, and remembered as decorations. But beneath every crown, beneath every veil, lived a heartbeat that dared to dream of freedom. Their pain is part of the empire's story, and history still whispers, if we dare to listen. Music fades, screen darkens. Empires rise on paper, but they bleed through people. The Ottoman court wrote its history in treaties and decrees, yet its truest chapters were hidden in the whispers of its women. And in the hidden chambers of power, some princesses learned to turn their fear into something far more dangerous: influence. Low percussion hum builds slowly, like a pulse beneath marble. Unlike the legends told by poets, these women did not need thrones. Their thrones were whispers in the sultan's ear, secrets in the guards' corridors, alliances struck in the shadows of candlelight. They became the quiet architects of storms. Some manipulated marriages of their younger sisters to weaken political rivals. Others made sure their sons would rise, even if it meant someone else's son would fall. The empire had taught them to be silent, but silence, in the right hands, could command armies. Subtle string tremolo underscores the tension. Yet, even in power, the memory of that wedding night remained like a wound beneath silk. Every decision, every calculated smile, was forged in that first moment of powerlessness. They became masters of control because control had once been ripped away from them. But some didn't play the game. Some rebelled. There are quiet mentions in imperial archives of princesses who refused their arranged marriages, who locked their chamber doors and did not open them when their husbands arrived. Their defiance was brief, but it shook the corridors. Painting, rough medieval canvas texture, cinematic realism, 16:9 aspect ratio, moody torchlight. One such story is whispered of Geverhan Sultan. Promised to a powerful pasha, she delayed her wedding night for days, an act considered unthinkable. The palace reacted with rage, the viziers with threats, but she stood unmoved, veiled and unyielding. It wasn't power that made her dangerous, it was her refusal. One orbed. Her defiance did not last forever. They forced the ceremony through, but from that night onward, the palace whispered of her, not as a bride, but as a storm waiting to break. They feared what a princess could become if she stopped being silent. And then there were those who wielded power beyond rebellion. Mihrama Sultan, daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, turned her forced marriage into a weapon of survival. Though her wedding night was scripted like every princess's, her future was not. She became one of the most politically influential women in the empire. Choir swells softly under the narration. She advised her father on imperial campaigns. She corresponded with foreign rulers, and behind the silk curtains of her forced union, she built alliances that outlived the men who once controlled her. In a world where wedding nights were cages, she turned her cage into a throne. But even she could not erase the cost. The generations of girls who came before her, and those who followed, trapped beneath silk and obedience. The empire's greatest deception was not the veil itself, but what it concealed. The agony of girls turned into political currency. Their stories were erased, their tears never recorded. But their influence bled quietly into the veins of the empire, changing it forever. Outside, the empire was feared for its armies, admired for its architecture, envied for its wealth. But inside, its daughters carried the weight of its foundation. They built nothing with their hands, but everything with their silence. And so, centuries later, the portraits remain, frozen in elegance, their eyes watching through time. To most, they are just royal faces. But if you look closer, past the paint, past the gold, you might see the shadow of what they endured. Music lowers to a haunting single cello note. They feared their wedding nights because they knew their bodies would become empires, their names would become footnotes, and their silence would become history's favorite lie. But history does not forget forever. It waits for someone to listen. Every empire carries its ghosts. For the Ottoman princesses, those ghosts lived not in battlefields, but in wedding chambers. Their terror, their resilience, their quiet rebellion shaped the course of dynasties that never bore their names. If we strip away the gold and silk, we find the trembling hands of girls who never chose their fate, but still shaped it.